Hi, I'm Codex, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about some nuances on how secondary stats work for ARMS and Fury Warriors and the ways that they can impact gameplay beyond simply saying they make DPS number get bigger. I'm not really going to be talking about stat ranks or stat priorities in any meaningful way, so if you want to know what stats are best for you, sim yourself. This video is focused on understanding how each stat influences our damage and how different contexts can greatly change the value of certain stats. Now, in my opinion, haste and crit are the most misunderstood secondary stats, especially for ARMS, so let's get the simpler secondaries out of the way, starting out with versatility. Versatility is literally the make DPS number get bigger stat because it's a straight up percent increase to your damage. However, there are a couple interactions that it has that you might not be aware of. For example, versatility increases the damage done by deep wounds if you're ARMS, resulting in it causing mastery's value to get increased as your versatility increases. It also increases the damage done by the Unholy Healing Gem, though somewhat ironically, it doesn't seem to affect the healing component of the gem, despite the fact that versatility is supposed to increase damage and healing. It also doesn't increase the healing done of Bloodthirst. Now, versatility typically increases the damage done by trinkets and other procs. This means that if you had two trinkets that either proc damage or did damage on use, they would most likely contribute to the value provided by versatility, and by extension, would make versatility more valuable for you than if you were to have two trinkets that provided strength or some other secondary stat. Versatility generally scales proportionally to the number of targets present, because more targets means more hits to increase the damage of. However, if you have a trinket that benefits from versatility, but it only does damage to one target, and having multiple targets present won't increase the number of times that it procs, well, then that means that versatility will have decreased returns as the number of targets increases. For Fury, Mastery works out much like versatility in that it functions like a straight percent damage increase. The only difference here is that it's a bigger increase, but that increase is not active all the time. Because this damage increase applies to cleaved abilities with Whirlwind, the value provided by Mastery scales proportionally to the number of targets present. At least this is true until there's more than 5 targets, because that's the maximum number of targets that you can hit at any one time using Whirlwind Cleaving. After that point, adding targets does not meaningfully increase the value of Mastery because there's so few abilities that Fury Warriors have that can hit more than 5 targets. For ARMS, it's kind of the same case, as it provides a percent damage increase, but unlike Fury's Mastery, Deep Wounds will be up a much higher percent of the time, and it also does damage in its own right, and this damage is modified by both haste and versatility. These two damage components make Mastery scale quite well as the number of targets increases. The value provided by the percent damage increase component increases as the number of targets increases, but because not all of your abilities can hit multiple targets, this value has decreasing returns as the number of targets increases. Because, well, you can only get the value of a percent damage increase if you're actually doing damage to the target. On the flip side, the fixed damage component, also known as the dot, of Deep Wounds scales proportionally as the number of targets increases, because as long as the dot gets applied and goes through its full duration, well, then you're going to get the full value of the dot. So having more applications of the dot means more damage, quite simply. For both specs, haste makes your auto attacks faster, reduces the cooldown of your primary abilities, and also makes your GCD shorter. For Fury, this makes haste a key component of the feedback loop of the spec, as it affects both ways that Fury Warriors generate rage, which is through auto-attacking and using abilities. And of course, the faster you generate rage, the sooner you can rampage, which gives you enrage, which increases your damage and increases your haste. The thing to understand, though, is that the value of haste does not significantly change as the number of targets increases. This is because having more targets present doesn't somehow make you have more auto-attacks land. And also, having a shorter GCD doesn't meaningfully change the rate of rage generation for Fury as the number of targets change. Yes, Whirlwind does generate more rage as the number of targets increases, and it also makes Bladestorm have a shorter duration, but the effect that these two things have on increasing the value of haste is not nearly as pronounced as how the value of Mastery, crit, and versatility increases as the number of targets increases. Now for ARMS, it's a different story. As previously mentioned, though, haste increases your attack speed and reduces your global cooldown duration. These changes occur at the exact same rate until you hit 100% haste, and the GCD hits its floor of being 0.75 seconds. This means that you're always going to attack once every 2.4 global cooldowns. This is true whether you have 0% haste, 13% haste, 47% haste, or even 99% haste. Your attack speed divided by your global cooldown duration will always be 2.4. This is important because it means that haste increases your rage generated per second, but not your rage generated per GCD. To put another way, for arms, haste does not increase rage generation relative to the number of opportunities to spend that rage. The only way that haste can impact your ability to fill all available GCDs is that it increases the number of attacks, which leads to you having more chances to proc sudden death, which would let you fill a GCD without having to spend rage. Now, a reasonable thing to ask at this point is, well, what about Skull Splitter and what about Wind Fury Totem? The thing is that while Wind Fury does increase your rage generated per GCD, it occurs at the same rate regardless of how fast you're attacking, which in this case is 20% of the time. Increasing haste increases the chances to proc Wind Fury, leading to more procs overall, and, well, yes, that increases your damage, but it also increases the number of GCDs that you have, meaning that having more or less haste won't change the amount of rage you generated per GCD available to you, even with Wind Fury. This also applies to Skull Splitter. Yes, its cooldown gets reduced with haste, meaning that you're going to have more opportunities to use it over the course of a fight, but because you also have more GCDs to use during that fight, you're only going to ever be able to use Skull Splitter at most once every 14 GCDs, meaning that the rage generated by Skull Splitter per GCD that you have available remains constant. Now, I am by no means implying that haste is not good for arms warriors. It does provide a good amount of value, but it simply does not affect rage generation in a way that can alter your need to do rage management. Now, a lot of people swear that haste makes arms feel much better to play. Are they wrong? Well, no. They are right that having more haste makes arms feel different to play. But just because it feels different to play doesn't mean that it actually is. Okay, so then why does rage management feel different with a lot of haste? What's happening here is that every so often, when you're playing arms, you're going to rage starve yourself, or you're going to have to hold off using slam for that GCD, or something like that. When this happens, the longer that you're sitting there waiting to do something, the worse it feels. Haste does not change the total amount of time that you're going to end up sitting there waiting over the course of a fight. But what it does do is spread that time out into smaller but more frequent chunks of time. Our brains tend to interpret big spikes of frustration as being far worse overall than lots of little spikes of frustration, even if the total amount of frustration is the same. This is why haste makes rage generation feel better. It turns fewer but larger spikes of frustrating waits into a lot of little spikes, and because it's doing that, it makes our brains think that it's much better to play. Now, in AoE situations for arms, haste also scales in a similar way to how it does for Fury in that it generally doesn't increase in value as the number of targets increases, though depending on what talents you've taken, that can change. For example, if you've taken Cleave, the value of haste will scale as the number of targets increases somewhat because of the fact that it reduces the cooldown on Cleave, which applies deep wounds on up to 5 targets. Crit can usually be thought of as a straight percent damage increase. This is because when you crit, the damage of that attack is increased by a percentage, so basically you would just multiply your chance to crit by the percentage the damage gets increased by whenever you do crit. And that's the effective percent increase of the damage caused by crit rating. Because of this, it scales proportionally to the number of targets that you hit, because quite simply, more hits means more chances to crit, and more targets generally means more hits. Now, for Fury, the only variable that has a meaningful chance at altering the value of crit is taking Dragon's Roar, which does increase crit damage, and therefore increase the value of crit if you take that talent. Now, for arms, crit causes auto attacks to generate more rage. This fact is an incredibly important difference from haste because since we always auto attack once every 2.4 GCDs, if we can get those auto attacks to generate more rage, well then obviously our rage generated per GCD will go up. This is a major reason why crit has more value for arms warriors than it does for Fury warriors. Increasing rage generated per GCD literally means that you're going to have more rage to spend on those GCDs. This means fewer empty globals, it means being able to use slam more often, which will then turn into more tactician procs, and then using more overpower, which makes Mortal Strike hit harder. Crit directly affects your play by giving you more GCDs where you will hit a button, unlike haste, which only increases the number of opportunities you have where you could hit a button. The other big reason for crit being valuable for arms warriors is that the value of crit gets further increased if you're talented into Rend, which increases your crit damage by 10% on targets where the debuff is active. So, since arms has these extra components that increase the value of crit, how does it scale in AoE then? Well, the value provided by auto-attack crits doesn't change as the number of targets increases because you're quite simply only auto-attacking a single target. And the extra crit damage provided by Rend only scales with the number of targets that you can have Rend applied to them, which after there's 3 or more targets becomes increasingly difficult to maintain and makes the value provided to crit from this source level off. After that point, it's going to scale much in the same way that it does for Fury, which is that It just scales proportionally with the number of hits that you can do to those multiple targets. I hope that this gives you a better understanding of how our secondary stats function for Arms and Fury Warriors, and also why you see certain patterns when doing stat weight simulations using various contexts. I especially hope that this helps you understand what haste actually does for Arms Warriors. But, as always, tell me why my opinions are dumb. Lastly, I just want to say thank you for watching this video, and subscribe for more.